It's Jim Monaghan here at 105.5 WDHA. And my guest this morning, I'm a huge fan of his work. I've been reading him for such a long time. He has a brand new book out, The Greatest Record Ever Made! Exclamation point, Volume 1. Carl Cafarelli, good morning and welcome here to WDHA.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. It is a pleasure to be on the Rock of New Jersey.
Now, how does somebody decide what the greatest record ever made is?
It's very simple. Don't. One at a time and live with it because we don't have to choose. All of us who love music so much that we can only say one song is the greatest, but we can only say that one at a time. And a minute later, there'll be something else that we love just as much. My friend Mike Browning put it, I think, even better than I did. Isn't whatever song you're listening to right now the greatest record ever made? And that's the nature of passion. That's the nature of loving pop music so much that you just think that it's the greatest. You know, I'm old enough to remember Beatlemania. I'm old enough to have lived through the late 60s and remember it, seeing the Monkees on TV, hearing AM radio, which was just so wonderful. Every song was a revelation, going through punk, going through all of that, and retaining that love of the music, the love I got from my parents and their Broadway albums and their pre-Pearl Harbor music, as my dad used to say. You know, we don't have to pick one. We can pick as many as we want and call it this is the greatest, and then a minute later, this is the greatest. And we're not being shallow. We're not being namby-pamby. We're loving music, and there's nothing wrong with loving music.
I don't remember the first greatest record ever made piece that you wrote, but I remember seeing something in Facebook and whatever the song was at the time, I go, yeah, that was a good song, but what about how could he leave this out? And then I realized that it was part of an ongoing series. And to go through chapter by chapter of this book is just one gem after another. How did you go about sequencing the book?
The same way that anyone would go about sequencing a mixtape, and that was feel in two senses. It wanted it to work as a mixtape. That's almost incidental, but it does work. I have a playlist. I've driven to Ohio and back listening to these songs in this specific sequence, and that worked. But more importantly, it had to flow as writing. I know that people who pick up a book like this are often going to go, oh, I want to read my favorite first. I want to read this song. But it was designed to be read from beginning to end in sequence for those so inclined. And I don't know that I realized this before I wrote it. I think after I finished it, I realized this book is my life story disguised as a book about pop music. And that's really, I think, true for many of us in the music that we love. Music isn't just our soundtrack, it's part of our lives. It's not just the soundtrack of our lives, it is an integral part of our lives for those of us who love it. It's not just background music, of course. It's part of the thing that flows in our blood, that we feel in our bones, that makes us move, that makes us dance, that makes us cry, that helps us when we have to cry, and all of that. It's not just one thing. So picking the songs was just an easy impulse of what song fit. I wrote way more than could fit in the book. Volume 1 was originally kind of a wink, yeah, maybe there'll be a volume, but there's certainly enough material written to do a volume 2 already. You
One of
mentioned,
the,
yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry.
No,
One
go
of the
ahead.
reasons I asked you about sequencing was because there were two chapters back to back, and
Mhm.
that's the Smithereens and the Cowsills.
Mhm.
And the Smithereens, Carl, that chapter is beautifully written
Thank you. Thank you so
because you
much.
really capture the essence, not just of the band,
Right,
but the song in particular, Behind the Wall of Sleep,
right.
so well. I mean, if I have any say in the matter, and you're just going to scramble through the book randomly,
Yeah.
start with that because our listeners here at WDHA know the Smithereens so well because they've been such a big part of the story of this radio station. But that chapter, Carl, is beautifully written.
Thank you. You're very kind to say that. As it says in the chapter, I was corresponding that night that he was slipping away, the Pat Denisio was slipping away. I was getting texts from my friends Rich and Kathy Firestone, who are the front line, part of the front line that I mentioned in the book, the people who went to see the Smithereens and stood at the front of the stage, and hence the name The Front Line. They were texting me their frantic worry about the fact that Pat was slipping away. But as I was receiving these texts, I was with my mom in the emergency room, knowing what was going to happen there, that she would soon be leaving her home, be relocated to adult living, and eventually she would pass at the end of 2021. So I don't want to say emotion comes easy. I don't want to say that music makes emotion come easy, but they're related. I mean, we love music for a reason, and all of these feelings come to the fore when we hear a favorite song. It doesn't matter if it's a rap song, if it's a power pop song, if it's Motown, if Do the Freddie, which is absolutely one of my top 10 songs. And I'll knock down anybody who says differently.
And the Cowsills chapter is a song that I'm not sure how many listeners know. I play it a lot on my Sunday show here at WDHA from the Global album, She Said to Me, which is just pure pop for now people, to steal a line from another artist.
Yeah, I love that record. And when I was writing the chapter for it, I spoke to Jim Babjack about it because I knew that he had been a fan and wanted Capitol to sign the Cowsills in the 90s. I'm not exaggerating when I say The Global is probably my favorite album of the 1990s. I can't imagine what I would put in its place if it wasn't that one. And there was a lot of great stuff in the 90s, but that's the one that rises to the top for me. I was corresponding with Bob Cowsill. I'm blanking about 1990, no, early 2000s, right about the time of Katrina, and they were looking for their brother. And he was giving me the time of day to a degree that he didn't have to. He had a lot more going on, but he still cared about corresponding with me as a fan and as an enthusiast. And when I got to meet him in 2019, when he realized who he was, his face lit up and said, "Hey, these are the guys I was telling you about." And introduced us to Paul and Susan. What a great band. What a great band that, like the Monkees, doesn't get the credit they deserve because the public's perception outweighs an open-minded acceptance of how wonderful their music is. The stuff they did in the 60s and early 70s is splendid. It's just wonderful stuff that deserves a wider audience. The 90s stuff is better still.
Mm. And Rhythm of the World, their most recent album, is really good as well. If there's a volume, whatever, 2, 3, 4, I'm sure there'll be a track from that in there.
I've heard, I don't know if this is true, that there's going to be a reissue of Global. I hope that's true because
they've been talking about that for a while, and I do hope that does happen because, as you said, it is such a great record.
I know that track from their Is It Any Wonder was the first one to see the light of day. Jordan Oakes included it on his first Yellow Pills Power Pop compilation, and that came out before Global did. And there's certainly some people who appreciate it. And when Global was a current thing, the Cowsills made the rounds of TV talk shows. I think they did a little bit. I would love to see a Cowsills show. I've seen the Cowsills on the Happy Together tour. I'd love to see them do a show where they're the headliners and they don't have to share the billing with other acts. As great as they are, the Cowsills steal any show that they're on. And I would love to see them do a whole show.
I frequently go down the power pop rabbit hole on my Sunday show here on DHA, and there is a ton of power pop in this, including Todd Rundgren's Couldn't I Just Tell You, which is definitely one of the greatest records ever made. It's one of those things, like you were saying, you listen to, go, yeah, that's it. That's the greatest record ever made. Certainly the Bangles, their version of Emmett Rhodes' Live. And I know in the book that you weren't all that familiar with Rhodes. Have you had a chance to explore his music?
Oh yeah. Matter of fact, there's a chapter that I took out for space about Fresh as a Daisy. And it was funny, years ago, man, I can't even remember how many years ago. This is before I knew who Emmett Rhodes was. I was talking with Gary Frenay, who was the bass player for the Flash Cubes, my favorite power pop group of all time. And at that time, I was trying to get around the idea of doing a book just about power pop. I didn't want to putting it aside because it wasn't really what I wanted to do. I didn't see a path forward. And he mentioned Emmett Rhodes. And I said, who's Emmett Rhodes? And he just gave me one of those cold looks and just said, and you want to write a book about power pop? And he just shrugged and walked away from me. Rightly so. I know better now.
If I can make some suggestions, if I could be so bold as to make some suggestions for an upcoming volume, Starry Eyes by the Records, Back of My Hand by the Jags.
Good choice.
Cool Jerk by the Capitals.
Yeah, great choice.
And it's longer than most of the songs that are in your book. I find the greatest song ever made tends to be somewhere between 2.5 and maybe 4 minutes. And that would be
the road.
Can't You Hear Me Knocking by the Rolling Stones. From the moment that guitar kicks in, Carl, it has me.
Yeah. Well, I can't disagree with any of that. I remember early 80s, I went through my biggest Stones phase, Beatles are always going to be my all-time favorite group because they're the Beatles. But at that point in the early 80s, I was had just graduated from college, living in my first apartment with my girlfriend, who later became my wife. And for some reason, at that point, the Rolling Stones became my favorite band for just a very brief period of time. I was listening to Sticky Fingers a lot. I was listening to Exile a lot. I was listening to the whole gamut of things that they had released from 63 to 82 and loving almost all of it, certainly including Can't You Hear Me Knocking. I think that was the first time I'd heard it, though, at least the first time I was conscious of it. A friend of mine said, you should listen to that. This is great. I love this.
And then there's the chapter on the Beatles song Rain, which, again, much like the Smithereens, you capture the essence of that song perfectly.
Yep. Yeah, that was always, as I was writing this book, that was always going to be the default choice, that if there has to be really just one greatest record ever made, that's the one I'd pick. It's not even necessarily my all-time favorite song. My all-time favorite song is Baby Blue by Badfinger. I actually do have one I can point to, and that was the first greatest record ever made chapter ever written back in 2016. The first one ever completed. But Rain, there's just something about it. I think I remember reading in Mojo. I'm going to try to paraphrase. In Mojo magazine did something about jukebox, stocking jukebox, whatever it was. And they talked about, picture this. It's 1966. You're a member of a lower echelon British beat group, popular, but not cutting edge. You're spending an evening out at the pubs in London. And one of the Beatles stops by with a new record, as they do every once in a while. The A-side plays. Paperback writer. Great. Who influenced? Wonderful. And then they turn the record over and they play Rain. And if you're a member of Herman's Hermits, you may as well just pack it in right now, because what's the freaking point? And I love Herman's Hermits.
Indeed. You and I also, and I mentioned this before we came on the air, we share a mutual love of the Monkees. And as you've said in your writings, you write about the Monkees a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And as well, I think you should, because just the impact that they had on so many different levels, made for TV or not, they had an impact. And I think it's criminal that they're not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame,
Absolutely.
or whatever the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is worth these days.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in the idea of rock and roll honoring its own. I know all of the negatives tossed at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they're all true. You know, what do we need a museum for? Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Why don't they call it the Pop Music Hall of Fame? They're all beside the point. Rock and roll should honor its own. Rock and roll is a big tent. I don't really even have an objection to a number of the artists getting in. Hip hop is part of rock and roll. I don't really have a problem with that, even though I listen to very, very little hip hop, very little hip hop. There's one hip hop chapter in the book about Grandmaster Melly Mel. Madonna, sure. I mean, actually, the one person that gives me pause who is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would be Percy Sledge, because as great as that song is, I'm not sure that he's got the resume to be in there. But they should also honor certainly acts like the Monkees, the New York Dolls, Paul Revere and the Raiders. The Monkees tops my list because they don't get the credit they deserve. They are enormously influential. When we talk about a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the three factors to consider would be popularity, artistic merit, but most of all, impact. Now, I think the Monkees had all three. They're certainly one of the most popular bands in the mid-'60s. Arguable whether or not they really outsold the Beatles in '67, as Mike Nesmith claimed, but then said I was joking and people took it seriously. But they were awfully, awfully popular. Said earlier, Timothy Leary was a fan, credited them for basically pushing the envelope more than any other band by making all of this weirdness, if you will, mainstream, by appearing on TV screens every week with long hair and not blowing things up and not being degenerates, not being subversive, other than the fact that they were slyly singing, well, maybe the Vietnam War is not such a great idea. And accomplishing that while smiling and performing catchy pop music that stands the test of time. A lot of that stuff, both the prefabricated stuff of the first two albums, the Hey Hey We're a Real Band of 1967's Headquarters, the hybrid of Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, Jones Limited, the stuff they did after that in diminishing group dynamic, and that brilliant dark movie Head, which is such a wonderful experience. I love that movie. I don't know if I'd love it as much if it wasn't the Monkees, but you can't separate it from the Monkees. It is the Monkees. It's the Monkees' death knell, but it's the Monkees. And I like to say it's the grit that gives the cotton candy substance. It's just a wonderful thing. I write about Porpoise Song, the theme from Head, as the greatest record ever made. And I often say that if the Monkees had done that and only that and nothing else, they should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on that basis. If you're going to put a one-hit wonder in or a one-song person in, put them in, and then sure, keep Percy Sledge too.
Yeah, the music from Head is just incredible.
Wonderful.
The songs from that. Carl, I can't thank you enough. For WDHA listeners who want to get this book, The Greatest Record Ever Made, Volume 1, I know it's available as a paperback and an ebook. Where can they go?
There are all manner of places. If you have a local bookstore, keep bookstores alive. Go to your local bookseller. Tell them that you want to get The Greatest Record Ever Made, Volume 1 by Carl Cafarelli. It's available through Ingram, so I think pretty much any independent bookstore can get it for you. It's on the usual places. It's on Apple Music as an ebook. It's on Barnes & Noble and Amazon as both an ebook and a paperback. If you're familiar with Cool Cat Music, the pop retailer who's actually released a number of compilation albums that me and my radio partner Dana Bond have put together, Cool Cat Music has it on hand, and they have autographed copies. So there's all manner of stuff. Contact me directly if you need to. But I like to see the people who are getting it out there get a little piece of the pie too.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Best of luck with this book, and I really
Thank
do
you.
hope there's a volume 2 and a volume 3, etc.
It's pretty definite that there will be. That's one of the advantages of self-publishing, is that I can make that decision myself.